Silver Mesa, New Mexico Territory, April 1884. The wind cut like iron filings, sharp enough to strip the skin off a man's thoughts. It came roaring down the red cliffs, dragging dust and ghosts with it. For 3 years I'd lived up there alone, just me, the mule, a Winchester, and the echo of a woman's voice I couldn't forget. Most days were the same. Dig the ore, haul the buckets, check the fence line before sundown. Silence had become my only partner. It didn't lie, didn't pity. Then that evening, something split the silence open. A sound, high, human, and desperate. At first I thought it was the wind playing tricks again, but then it came a second time, shorter, sharper, a scream that didn't belong to the land. I dropped the coil of wire in my hands and started down the ridge. The sky was bruised purple. The last light clung to the stone like old blood. My boots sank into the soft dust where the sagebrush grew thin. It took me 20 minutes to find the source. There, in the middle of a dry basin, stood a weathered post, maybe once a boundary marker, maybe a warning. Now it was a gallows of another kind. A woman was tied to it, her arms stretched tight, wrists cut raw from rope. Her head hung forward, dark hair tangled with sand. She was young, maybe 20, with the copper-brown skin of the Apache and a mouth that looked stubborn even in pain. The ground around her was disturbed, hoof prints, boot prints, then nothing. Whoever left her here wanted her to die slow and wanted the vultures to know where to start. I didn't move for a while. The wind hummed through the post like a low note from God himself. Every instinct in me said, turn around. This wasn't my fight. Out here, stepping into someone else's business could shorten your life by a good 50 years. Then she moved, barely, a breath, a twitch of her fingers. That tiny motion punched right through the armor I'd built since Abigail died. The same way my wife used to reach for me in her fever dreams. A plea without words, just life refusing to quit. I slung the Winchester off my shoulder and circled slow, scanning the horizon. The mesa stretched empty in every direction, red rock bleeding into the dusk. Still, I could feel eyes somewhere, men who'd left her there, maybe watching now to see what fool might interfere. I drew my knife and knelt. The smell of sweat and blood mixed with sun-baked rope. Easy, I muttered. Her head jerked up, eyes wild and fierce. Not fear, defiance. A pair of dark coals that refused to die. Don't touch me, she rasped. Her voice was raw, half air. I'm not the one who tied you here, I said. But you'll be dead by dawn if I walk away. She stared, studying me like a hawk, judging distance to a snake. Finally, a small nod. I cut the ropes one by one. When the last strand fell, she crumpled into my arms, lighter than I expected, bones under torn buckskin. I felt her ribs move against my chest fast, shallow breaths. A knife handle gleamed near her belt. I slid it free and tossed it aside. You can have it back once you can stand. Her lips twitched. You afraid of a dying woman? No, I said. I'm afraid of wasting time arguing with one. The corner of her mouth almost smiled. Then she passed out cold. The wind picked up again, driving grit into my teeth. I hoisted her over my shoulder and started toward the ridge. Each step sank deep in the sand, the kind that eats strength fast. The basin behind me already looked less like a place and more like a bad dream I'd soon deny ever happened. At the top of the rise, I turned once more. The post stood alone in the fading light, a black line against the dying Sunday. There were birds circling now, late, hungry. I kept walking. By the time I reached my claim, the moon had climbed over the cliffs. My cabin crouched against the rocks. A box of pine and stone, no bigger than the space I kept between myself and the rest of the world. I laid her on the cot by the fire. Up close, she looked worse, bruises on her throat, split lip, blood crusted on her cheek. Whoever had done this wasn't just cruel. They were sending a message. I fetched water, cleaned the wounds as best I could. She stirred once, muttering words in Apache I didn't understand. I wrapped her wrists in linen, poured whiskey on the cuts. She didn't flinch. Even unconscious, her body resisted pity. When I was done, I sat on the stool beside her. My hands trembled a little, not from fear, but from something I hadn't felt in a long time: responsibility. Her breathing steadied, the cabin filled with the small, living sound of someone other than me. Outside, the wind shifted. It carried the scent of rain that would never come. I leaned back, staring at the ceiling, wondering what kind of fool steps between a woman and the men who want her dead. Then again, fools are the only kind left with any honor. Sometimes you do what's right, not what's smart. And in that quiet room, lit by a single oil flame, I realized I just invited the whole damn world back into my life. If you enjoy the story, hit that subscribe button right away. And if you don't, then just hit the like button anyway to keep more Wild West love stories coming. She woke before dawn, like a creature sensing danger before sight. The first thing she did was reach for the knife that wasn't there. "Easy," I said. She froze. Her eyes darted around the cabin, landing on me by the fire, hands open, palms bare. "Where am I?" "Safe for the moment. I found you tied to a post out by Dead Horse Basin." Her jaw tightened. "You should have left me there." "Thought about it," I said, pouring coffee into a tin cup. "Didn't sit right." The wind outside pushed at the walls, dry and mean. The boards creaked like an old man's bones. She tried to sit up, but fell back with a hiss, one hand clutching her ribs. "You're hurt," I said. "Stay still. I've been hurt before." "I can tell." I handed her the cup. She stared at it like it might be poisoned, then took a sip. The smell of bitter coffee filled the small space, mingling with the scent of smoke and sweat and dust that had nowhere else to go. "My name's Elias Ward," I said. She hesitated before answering. "Taya." The name fit the land, sharp, strong, and lonely. For a long while we didn't speak. The fire cracked, the wind groaned, and time folded in on itself the way it does when two people are trying not to think about what comes next. When she finally looked at me, there was no gratitude in her eyes, only caution, the kind born from too many betrayals to count. "Why help me?" she asked. "Guess I was tired of watching things die." "That's not a reason. It's the only one I've got." Her gaze softened just a fraction, a moment's tremor in steel. "Men like you helped take our land." "I know,"
It is good to be
I
with
said
you
quietly,
here tonight, Elias.
"and I've been paying for it ever since." That silenced us again, but this time the silence wasn't empty. It was heavy, full of the ghosts we both carried. Outside, the dawn pushed pale light through the window slats. I could see her more clearly now, the bruise under her jaw, the small scar by her temple, the kind of marks that don't just happen. They're made by hands that enjoy it. "You can rest here till you're strong enough to move," I said. "I don't need your charity." "It's not charity, it's decency. Don't confuse the two." Her eyes flicked to the rifle leaning against the wall. "You live alone?" "3 years now." "Then, why?" "Because the woman I loved died, and the world felt quieter without anyone left to lie to." She looked down, fingers tracing the blanket's rough weave. "Then you understand more than most." We stayed like that for hours, two ghosts sharing the same air. By nightfall, I'd patched her wounds again, fed her a little stew, and fixed a second blanket over her. She didn't thank me, but she didn't turn away when I adjusted it either. On the second day, she managed to sit up and asked for water. I brought it, and she drank slow, watching me over the rim of the cup like a wolf, testing whether a trap was real. "Your people nearby?" I asked. "Not anymore. The government moved them south after the treaty. My grandfather stayed behind." "Chief Dazan." She lifted her head sharply. "You know that name? Everyone around these parts knows it. He's the only Apache leader who still thinks peace is possible." A faint smile ghosted across her lips. "He still does, but peace is something the white men never learned to keep." Her words cut cleaner than any knife. I didn't argue. There wasn't a single lie in what she said. 3 nights passed. She healed slow but steady. The fever broke, leaving her skin cool but her spirit still burning hot. Once I caught her outside, standing barefoot under the moon, whispering something in Apache. Her voice carried through the canyon like smoke, soft, stubborn, holy. "You shouldn't be up," I said. She didn't turn. "You shouldn't have saved me." "Maybe not." She glanced over her shoulder, eyes catching the firelight like wet stone. "They'll come for me." "Who?" "The men who left me there. Government bounty hunters. They want to break my grandfather's will, force him to sign away Mescalero land. I refused to help them, so they made an example of me. Politics, I muttered. That explains the cruelty. It explains nothing, she said. Cruelty never needs reason. Her voice trembled slightly, not from fear, but fury held too long. I took a step closer. You have somewhere to go when you're healed. She gave a bitter laugh. Nowhere that isn't burning. The way she said it made something twist inside me. I'd known loss, but not the kind that comes from watching your whole world erased. She stepped closer, her shadow crossing mine. When they come, you'll die with me. Then I'll make sure it's worth dying for. Her chin lifted. You'd risk your life for a stranger. I already have. Might as well see it through. Something flickered in her expression, a crack in the armor, just for a heartbeat. She didn't answer, just went back inside and lay down with her back to me. The rest of the night I sat by the fire, feeding it wood and questions I couldn't answer. The flames licked the walls, painting everything the color of old blood. I remembered Abigail's last night, the way her hand had slipped from mine, the way silence had swallowed her faster than I could breathe. For years I'd tried to fill that silence with work, whiskey, and distance. None of it stuck. Now here was another woman I barely knew, her life tangled in mine by chance and conscience. Around midnight, the coyotes started calling low, mournful, like the desert itself was warning me to let her go. But the longer I listened, the more I realized it wasn't warning at all. It was witness. Before dawn, I checked the perimeter, old habits from wilder days. The prints from the horses I'd followed were fading, but there were new ones by the ridge. Lighter. Maybe scouts, maybe ghosts. Either way, it meant trouble. When I came back inside, Taya was awake again, sitting by the cold fire, blanket around her shoulders. The light touched her face, and for a moment, she looked young, too young to be this hunted. They're close, I said. I know. How? I can feel the ground change when they ride. The land tells me. I nodded. Then we'll move before sunrise. I know a canyon west of here, narrow, safe enough for a few days. You'd hide with me? Until I can figure out a smarter plan. Her mouth curved, the first real smile I'd seen from her. You said it yourself. Doing what's smart isn't your way. Yeah, I said, strapping on my gun belt. I have a talent for poor decisions. She watched me pack supplies, beans, cartridges, a little salt. Then she said quietly, "You're different from the others." "I've been told that," I said. "No," she whispered. "I mean you carry your grief like a weapon, not a wound." I stopped, unsure how to answer. "Maybe both," I said finally. By the time the sun broke over Silver Mesa, we were ready. She still limped when she walked, but she refused to ride the mule. Pride runs deep in people who've had everything taken from them. We left the cabin just as the first light touched the red cliffs. The wind was calmer now, but the land still held its breath, waiting. Taya turned once, looking back at the small cabin half swallowed by stone and distance. "You built this alone?" "Yeah. It's a good place." It was. We rode in silence, two shadows stretching long across the waking desert. The trail wound down toward the dry riverbed, past juniper and brittle sage. I caught her watching me once, maybe trying to understand why a man would risk everything for someone he didn't know. I didn't have an answer for her hell. I barely had one for myself. All I knew was this. I wasn't rescuing her. I was rescuing the part of me that had gone silent when Abigail died, the part that still believed doing right mattered, even when nobody was watching. As the sun climbed higher, we disappeared into the canyons, two fugitives bound by accident, by pain, and by the faint, dangerous possibility of redemption. If you like Wild West love stories or Wild West stories, drop a bunch of 1 second and your place in the comments for the Wild West Love channel. Tell me where you're listening from, so I don't feel so alone out here. 2 days later, we rode out. I packed enough supplies for a week, loaded the mule, and gave her the better horse. She didn't argue, just cinched the saddle straps with a practiced pull that told me she'd been doing it long before I was born. "Where we headed?" I asked. "North," she said. "There's a canyon where my people used to camp. Few know it now." The first light had barely touched the mesas. The air still held a hint of night, that cool breath before the sun turns everything cruel. Our shadows stretched long and thin across the red ground as we moved. She rode like the land belonged to her, bones back straight, movements quiet. The horse obeyed every small shift of her weight. I rode beside her, keeping the rifle balanced across my thigh. Words were scarce, which suited us both. Out here, talking too much was like wasting water. By the third mile, she asked, "You ever kill a man for money?" I looked ahead, where the trail vanished between two cliffs, the color of rust. "Once," I said. "Didn't make me richer." She nodded like that was the only answer worth giving. "Then you understand." We passed the remains of a riverbed, its surface cracked like old leather. Wind moved through it, hissing in the reeds that had long turned to bone. Every now and then a hawk circled above, a black stitch in a white sky. Somewhere between those ridges, she began to hum a low, rhythmic sound that didn't belong to any hymn I knew. It was older, shaped by breath and memory, the kind of tune people use when words can't reach far enough. "What's that song?" I asked. "It doesn't have a name," she said. "It calls the spirits of the ground to walk with us." "Do they ever answer?" "Always," she said simply. The wind carried her humming ahead of us. I found myself listening for it when she stopped, missing the sound before I'd realized it was gone. At dusk, we found the place she'd spoken of, a canyon split by a rock that looked like a heart cracked in two. The sun dropped behind it, spilling red light across the sand. I unloaded the mule while she gathered dried branches and laid them in a circle. When the fire caught, the canyon walls glowed as if the rock itself remembered old battles. She crushed herbs between two stones, the smell sharp and clean. "For your shoulder," she said, handing me a small cloth bundle. "I'm not the one bleeding. Doesn't matter. Pain lives in both." I pressed the bundle against my skin just to humor her. The scent reminded me of rain that never quite reached the ground. That night, she told me about the long walk, how soldiers forced her people across hundreds of miles of desert, how her grandmother died before they reached the reservation. She spoke in that even tone of someone who'd carried the story so long it had carved itself into bone. When she finished, she stared into the flames. "My grandmother said the earth remembers everything, the feet that walk on it, the blood that spills into it. Someday it will give the memories back." "What do you think it'll give back?" I asked. "Whatever we deserve." Her hands were shaking slightly, though her voice stayed steady. The firelight trembled on her skin, turning her eyes to liquid bronze. "And you?" she asked finally. "What ghosts ride with you?" "My wife," I said. "Abigail. Fever took her 3 summers ago." "Do you still love her?" "Every day." She nodded slowly, like she'd expected that answer. "Then don't let that love turn to stone." The flames painted her face in gold and shadow. She wasn't beautiful in the way of polished things. She was something raw, the first rain after a drought, the taste of water on cracked lips. We ate quietly, the stew thin but hot. Somewhere in the dark, a night bird called, long and low. When the coyotes began their chorus, I realized I'd been staring at her too long. She met my gaze without flinching. For a heartbeat, neither of us looked away. And something wordless passed between us, something neither of us was ready to name. Later, as the fire burned down to coals, she lay back, arms crossed over her chest like a warrior at rest. "If they come," she whispered, "you run." "Not a chance," I said. "I've done enough running." She didn't argue, just closed her eyes, lips forming silent words I didn't understand. The wind shifted then, carrying the faint rumble of thunder or hooves. Hard to tell which in the desert night. I stayed awake, watching her sleep. Every so often she twitched, muttering in Apache, the words rough like gravel. The moon slid across the canyon walls, cutting her face in half, one side in silver, one in shadow. I thought about Abigail again. Her hands white as milk, the way she'd braided her hair before bed, the way she'd whispered, "Keep living, Caleb." Strange how grief turns a man's name into a stranger's echo. When dawn came, the air smelled of rain that hadn't yet fallen. I found her sitting on the ridge, knees drawn up, watching the sky turn gold. "You sleep at all?" I asked. "Not much. The land moves at night. You listen close, you can hear it breathe. Doesn't sound restful. Though it isn't meant to be." We packed in silence. The canyon looked different in daylight, less sacred, more scarred. But it was shelter, and shelter was life. By mid-morning, the sun began to bite. She led us along the dry creek until it narrowed between tall stone walls. The path forced us close, our boots scraping the same dust. "You ever wonder," she said suddenly, "why you didn't just keep riding when you found me?" "Every damn hour," I admitted. "And the answer? I don't know. Maybe I wanted to see if the world could still surprise me." That earned a small laugh. It did. The canyon turned west, opening onto a field of dead mesquite. We stopped to rest the horses. I checked the sky, the kind of clear that made a man uneasy. Too still, too blue. She knelt by a patch of wild sage and pressed her palm to the earth. "Tracks," she said. I joined her. "Deer?" She shook her head. "Men. 3, maybe 4. They passed here yesterday. Bounty hunters. Maybe. Maybe ghosts. Let's assume the living kind." We moved on, slower now. The air grew tense, stretched thin between us. At noon we found an old fire pit. Still warm. I crouched beside it, sifting ash between my fingers. "They're close." Taya's jaw clenched. "Then we make them chase what they can't catch." "Meaning?" She pointed east. "There's a ridge that drops into a box canyon. If they follow, we'll have the high ground." Sounds risky. Everything worth doing is. I almost smiled. "You sound like me." "I hope not," she said, but there was a trace of warmth in it. We rode till dusk. The light bled out slow, turning the world to copper. I felt every muscle ache, every old scar stir. When we stopped again, she built the fire while I cleaned the rifles. She worked in silence. Movements precise, efficient. "You trust me yet?" I asked. She didn't look up. "Trust is a path, not a door." "Then I'll keep walking." She finally met my eyes. "Don't walk too far. I've buried enough men who tried." Later, as the stars came out, she reached into her pouch and pulled out a small leather charm, a circle of woven hair and bone. "For protection," she said. "My grandmother made it." "You sure she'd want you giving it to a stranger?" "She said to give it to someone who listens. You listen, even when you don't like what you hear." I took it carefully, feeling its weight or maybe its history. "Thank you." "Don't thank me yet," she said softly. "You might need it soon." The night deepened. The horses shifted restlessly. I cleaned my gun one last time and lay back, staring at the endless stars. Somewhere, thunder rolled again, closer now, and I wasn't sure if it was the sky or the sound of men coming to collect their debts. Before sleep claimed me, I heard her whisper in Apache, words I couldn't understand but somehow felt. Part prayer, part promise, part warning. And for the first time in 3 years, I wasn't entirely sure whether I wanted to survive or simply keep riding beside her until the desert itself decided what we deserve. "Hey there, friend, take a moment and get yourself a full glass of water. Your body will thank you." They found us at dawn, the kind of dawn that comes without color, just a thin gray light bleeding across the flats, cold as steel, quiet as guilt. 3 riders, 2 bounty men, and a lawman wearing a badge he didn't deserve. Their silhouettes crested the ridge like stains on the horizon, dark against the waking Sunday. Taya saw them first. She was crouched by the horses, running her fingers through the dust, reading it the way a preacher reads scripture. "They followed the tracks," she said, voice calm, as if she'd been expecting it all along. I checked the Winchester, feeling the familiar click of the lever, the weight of inevitability. "Then we'll make sure they regret it." We moved fast. The land around us flattened into the white flats, a stretch of bleached earth that went on forever, cracked and cruel underfoot. It was the kind of place where a man could lose his way or his life, and the desert wouldn't bother to remember which came first. I took position behind a fallen log, half buried and sun-bleached. From there, I could see for miles. The light was climbing, turning the edges of the world into molten copper. Taya rode out toward the center, her figure small against the endless pale. She looked back once, eyes meeting mine across the distance. No words, just trust the dangerous kind, the kind that gets men killed. The riders came fast. Hooves thundered, stirring the air thick with grit. The first one, a big man with a red bandana and a shotgun, broke from the others, heading straight for her. I steadied the rifle, drew a slow breath, and fired. The shot cracked like thunder. The horse screamed, reared, then crashed to the ground, throwing its rider. Dust swallowed him whole. The other two split, one cutting north, one keeping straight. The badge caught the sun, a glint of authority trying to pass for righteousness. Taya spurred her horse, veering left, pretending to flee. She shouted something in Apache, words that rolled through the air like a war cry. The bounty man chased her. I could see the sweat on his neck even from where I was. He never saw the flash of her revolver. "Your kind knows nothing of mercy," she shouted. 2 shots, 1 echo. The man tumbled from the saddle before the sound even faded. The last one, the lawman stopped his horse, dismounted, crouched low behind a rock. He had that slow, deliberate air of someone who thinks the world owes him a victory. He cupped his hands and shouted, "She's property of the territory." The words hit me harder than I'd expected. Property. A word men use when they've forgotten what people are for. I stood, stepped from cover, rifle leveled. "No," I said. "She's the reason it still has a soul." He squinted, lips curling. "You know what you're doing, boy? Harboring a fugitive? That's hangin' work." "I've been dead a long time," I said. "Just didn't stop breathing yet." He raised his gun. My finger found the trigger first. The sound tore through the flats, a single note of justice in a key older than law. The echo carried far, bouncing off the canyon walls until it was hard to tell who'd been shot. Then the lawman dropped, his badge catching one last glint of sun before it vanished in the dust. For a moment, nothing moved. Even the wind paused, waiting to see if there was more killing left to do. When the dust finally cleared, I saw Taya walking toward me. Her face streaked with dirt, her braids half undone, eyes bright with a fire that didn't belong to fear. "It's over," I said. "For now," she answered. "They'll send more. Then we keep moving." She shook her head. "No, we stay. My people will come." I looked at the 3 bodies scattered across the flats, their shadows shrinking as the sun rose higher. "They'll start to rot by noon." "Let the desert take them," she said. "It owes them nothing." She knelt beside one of the dead men, the youngest of the 3, maybe 20 if that. She closed his eyes with a soft touch. "He didn't know better," she murmured. "You believe that?" "I have to. If not, then we're no different." Her mercy unsettled me more than her fury had. "You didn't have to fight," she said, standing, brushing sand from her hands. "I know. So why?" I glanced toward the horizon. "Because redemption isn't a word. It's a decision." She stepped closer, close enough that I could smell the smoke still clinging to her skin. Then she reached out, pressed her palm against my chest, right over the heart that hadn't known warmth in years. "Then you chose right." Her hand lingered there, steady, sure. The world seemed smaller in that moment, just the 2 of us, the wind, and the faint sound of the horses shifting nervously nearby. We buried the men shallow. The ground was too hard to dig deep, and the desert doesn't keep secrets anyway. I piled stones over the bodies, not for their sake, but for mine. The act of covering death feels almost like faith if you squint hard enough. By afternoon, heat shimmered over the sand, blurring the horizon. We moved what we could salvage: water, ammunition, the badge from the dead lawman. I flipped it once in my hand before tossing it into the dust. "Why keep it?" she asked. "Reminds me what kind of man I don't want to be." We led the horses toward the shade of a dry ravine. The sun beat down like a punishment. Every breath tasted of salt and grit. Taya spoke after a long silence. "You fight like someone who's done it too often." "Maybe," I said. "Or maybe I'm just tired of losing." "No." She looked at me then, not just looking, but seeing. "You think this will fix something inside you?" "No," I said. "But it keeps it from getting worse." She smiled faintly. "That's almost wisdom." The rest of the day passed in slow rhythm, the living kind of silence that follows violence. We set up camp beneath the shadow of the ridge. I cooked beans while she sat sharpening her knife, the sound small but steady, like a heartbeat made of steel. At dusk, the sky turned the color of rusted copper. The wind carried the faint scent of rain, though none had fallen yet. Taya broke the silence. "When I was little, my grandfather said the desert tests every soul that crosses it. It shows what's true." "And what did it show you?" "That I'm still here." Her voice was calm, but I saw the tremor in her hand as she stirred the fire. I took a long breath. If your people come, what then? You'll go back? Maybe. Maybe not. They'll need to know what's coming. What is coming? She looked up, eyes catching the firelight. War, if the territory keeps pushing. They want the land, the water, the ore. They always want something. And what do you want? To live without owing anyone my breath. That hit something deep. Freedom has a sound to it when spoken by someone who's never had it. Night fell hard. The first drops of rain came in brief whispers, darkening the sand, carrying the smell of lightning. We pulled the tarps over our gear and sat under the outcrop, the world humming around us. After a while I said, "You believe in God?" She thought about it. "I believe in balance. What you give, you get. What you destroy, you lose." "You?" "I believe in second chances," I said. "Even for men like you, only for men like me." The rain fell steady then. Not much, but enough to cool the ground. She leaned her head back, letting the drops hit her face, eyes closed. "You hear that?" she whispered. "What?" "Rain on stone. My grandmother said it's the sound of forgiveness." We sat there listening to it until the thunder rolled again, softer now, like the sky had run out of anger. When the fire dimmed, she moved closer, close enough that our shoulders brushed. Neither of us spoke. The kind of silence that grows between two people who've seen too much. It doesn't need words. It just needs room. That night, the wind carried the scent of rain again, and for the first time, I thought it might actually fall. If you're watching on TV, don't hesitate, grab your phone and hit subscribe to my channel so you'll never miss out on our amazing characters. Winter passed with the sound of water running again through the gullies. It started as a trickle, then a murmur, then the steady voice of life returning to a place that had nearly forgotten what that sounded like. The desert, stubborn as an old mule, was softening. Even the rocks seemed to breathe again. The air smelled of wet sage and earth. The cold mornings gave way to afternoons of light that didn't sting but warmed slow, like forgiveness. Taya's people came quietly. No war drums, no songs. Just a procession of shapes moving through the heat shimmer, cautious as deer stepping into a clearing. Men with wary eyes, women who carried both children and rifles. Every one of them looked at me as though weighing whether I belonged to the living or the dead. They took the silver I offered not as charity, but as pact. It wasn't much compared to what I'd once dug from the ground, but it was enough to buy rifles, seed, medicine, time. And time, in this country, is worth more than gold. Chief Dasan came last, riding a paint horse that looked too proud for its years. His hair was white, his eyes sharp as obsidian. He studied me a long while before speaking. "You were the one who saved my granddaughter," he said. "I tried to," I answered. His mouth twitched, not quite a smile. "Trying is enough for honest men. Most stop before that." He dismounted, placed a hand on my shoulder. "Silver Mesa remembers the blood that was spilled here. Maybe yours will balance some of it." That was the closest thing to a blessing I'd ever received. Weeks blurred into something like peace. I built a new roof for the cabin, patched the fence, planted beans in a strip of soil, so poor it made the plants fight for every inch. Still, they grew. Everything does, if it's stubborn enough. Taya taught me the names of birds. She spoke them softly in her language, then made me repeat them in mine. I got most wrong, which made her laugh a sound rare enough that I'd do it on purpose just to hear it again. At night, she'd sit by the fire, weaving bits of cloth or carving symbols into small pieces of bone. For strength, she'd say, for remembering. Sometimes, at sunset, we'd walk up to the ridge and watch the sky burn itself clean. She'd rest her head on my shoulder not as lover yet, but as someone unafraid to be near. That meant more than any promise ever could. The days lengthened, the world warmed. The mine still gave a little silver, enough for trade, but I no longer cared about the yield. What I dug for now wasn't ore, it was quiet. It was purpose. It was mornings when she hummed while the coffee boiled and the smell of wood smoke meant home instead of solitude. One evening, after supper, we sat outside, wrapped in the same blanket, watching the last light bleed over the mesas. The sky was all fire and mercy. She broke the silence first. "Abigail would be proud," she said. "How would you know?" Because she loved you once, she said simply. And so do I. The words didn't land like a blow or a confession. They settled between us like dust, gentle, final, true. I took her hand, calloused and warm. I don't know if I deserve another chance. Red. Deserves got nothing to do with it, she said. Living does. We stayed like that until the stars came out, until the land around us no longer felt empty. Somewhere far off, a coyote called. She answered softly, a low sound that made the night feel alive again. Later, as the fire died, I asked, "Do you ever miss what was?" She thought for a long time. "You can't miss what never belonged to you," she said, "but you can honor it. The trick is not letting it own you." Amo. Her wisdom always came like that, quiet, almost casual, but it struck deep. Spring came early that year. The rains didn't last long, but they came honest. The streams swelled, washing away the dust of things better forgotten. The valley turned green in places that hadn't seen color in years. Even the cactus bloomed a rare, shy beauty that made you believe in small miracles. One morning, I rode out to the mine and found her there, standing in the shaft's mouth, sunlight on her face. "You shouldn't come here," I said. "It's dangerous." She smiled. "I wanted to see where your ghosts sleep." "Most of them don't sleep," I said. "They just wait." She picked up a handful of silver dust, let it fall through her fingers. "This is what men kill for." "Sometimes," I said. "Sometimes it's what they die for." She looked at me then, steady, unflinching. "And you?" "I'm trying to live for something instead." That earned a small nod. "Good. The land remembers what you give it." We rode back together. The wind was warm on our faces, full of the scent of rain that had already passed. The next week brought visitors, traders from Phoenix, a priest from Santa Fe, and 2 riders from the territorial office who came to check on mining operations. I knew what they wanted, to see if the Apache were gathering again, to decide if the land was worth taking twice. Chief Dasan met them with grace that could have shamed kings. I stood behind him, silent. The silver we'd traded for supplies gleamed in the sun, proof that we were more useful alive than conquered. When the riders left, Taya came to me. "They'll be back," she said. "I know." "Then what?" "Then we keep living. That's the best rebellion there is." She smiled. "You sound like an Apache now. Maybe I'm just learning what freedom tastes like." At night, I dreamed less of Abigail. Not because she was gone, but because she'd finally stopped needing to remind me she existed. Grief doesn't vanish. It changes shape, turns from knife to scar, from weight to reminder. One evening, as the wind died and the first stars began to show, Taya and I sat outside again. The air smelled of mesquite and ash. She spoke softly. "When you look at me, what do you see?" "Someone strong," I said. "Someone who survived what would have broken most. Someone who taught me that mercy isn't weakness." She smiled. "Then maybe we both learn." I used to think love was what healed you," I said. "But maybe it's the healing that makes love possible." She leaned against me. "Then keep healing." And I did. In small ways. In mornings that didn't feel heavy. In nights that didn't echo. In her laughter when I tried speaking her language and got every word wrong. The West is full of ghosts. Some walk beside you. Some sleep in your arms. And sometimes, if you're lucky, one teaches you how to live again. Now when the sun rises over Silver Mesa, it hits the ridge first, turning it gold. I stand there sometimes, watching the light move across the land, and think maybe this is what peace looks like. Not silence, not absence, but balance. The mine still gives a little silver, enough for trade. But that's not what I dig for anymore. I dig for quiet, for the hum of her song in the morning, for the laughter that sounds like forgiveness. Sometimes I still feel the weight of old sins, the pull of ghosts I never buried right. But then Taya will walk past, her hand brushing mine, and the world tilts toward the living again. If there's a heaven, it probably looks a lot like this, raw, imperfect, and honest. A place where broken souls can rest without pretending they're whole. If you've made it this far, I know you're a true fan of WWL. From the bottom of my heart, I wish your day is filled with health and happiness, and may a little stroke of luck find you in the next 15 minutes. Don't forget to share it with me in the comments. Today's story is about pains that seemed to have no way out until a small ray of light changed everything.